Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud of guilt, thick enough to hide sins, but thin enough to let them breathe. Captain Elias Crane stood at the bow of the Retribution, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the British naval vessel HMS Sovereign rock gently in the protected waters. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment. 3 months since he'd felt the rope around his neck and the jeers of his former crew echoing in his ears. The scar across his throat still burned in the salt air, a permanent reminder of Commodore Montrose's mercy. The British admiral had cut him down just as his vision began to fade, choosing exile over execution, a decision he would soon regret. "Captain," whispered Torres, his first mate, appearing beside him like a shadow. The lean Spaniard's eyes reflected the same hunger for revenge that had consumed Elias for months. "The girl's carriage approaches the dock, right on schedule." Elias adjusted his tricorn hat, concealing the hatred that threatened to boil over. Isabella Montrose, the admiral's precious daughter, had arrived for her morning constitutional along the harbor, a routine her father's men had foolishly maintained even in these dangerous waters. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same arrogance that had nearly cost him his life would now cost Montrose something far more valuable. "Remember," Elias said, his voice rough as ship's rope, "no unnecessary bloodshed. We take the girl, leave the message, and disappear before the harbor patrol realizes what's happened." The carriage wheels echoed against the cobblestones as Isabella's elegant coach drew closer. Through his spyglass, Elias caught his first glimpse of his target. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 20, with auburn hair that caught the morning light like copper pennies. Her pale blue dress spoke of privilege and protection, 2 things she was about to lose. As the carriage stopped near the merchant's wharf, Elias felt his chest tighten. For a moment, doubt flickered through his mind like candlelight in a storm. Then he remembered the weight of the noose, the betrayal of his crew, the way Montrose had smiled as he'd pronounced his merciful sentence. "Now," he commanded. His men moved like practiced thieves through the morning fog. 6 of them, armed but disciplined, surrounded the carriage before the driver could reach for his pistol. The horses whinnied nervously as Torres placed a blade to the coachman's throat, while 2 others handled the footman with swift efficiency. Isabella emerged from the carriage with startling composure, her chin raised despite the obvious terror in her green eyes. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady as a ship's bell, "I assume you have business with my father?" Elias stepped forward, removing his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly courtesy. "Miss Montrose, your reputation for intelligence precedes you." She studied his face with unsettling directness, her gaze lingering on the scar across his throat. "And you must be the pirate my father spared?" How predictable. The words hit him like a physical blow. Even she knew about his humiliation, his fall from the legendary Captain Crane to a broken man begging for his life. The rage that had sustained him through months of planning surged fresh and hot. "Your father's mercy," he said, stepping closer until she could smell the salt and gunpowder on his clothes, "comes with a price, one he's about to pay." Isabella didn't flinch, though he could see her pulse racing at her throat. "And what price is that, Captain?" "You." The word hung between them like the morning mist, heavy with implication. Around them, the harbor continued its daily business, unaware that a drama of revenge and consequence was unfolding in their midst. Seagulls cried overhead, their calls mixing with the distant sound of ship bells and working men's voices. "My father will hunt you to the ends of the earth," Isabella said quietly. Elias smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let him try. He'll find that the man he showed mercy to has learned the value of ruthlessness." As his men escorted Isabella toward the Retribution, Elias noticed how she moved, not with the helpless stumbling of a terrified captive, but with the measured steps of someone choosing dignity over despair. It was unsettling, this composure in the face of danger. "Leave the message where her father will find it," he instructed Torres. The note was simple. "Your mercy created your nightmare. For every day of my exile, she will know the same. Captain Crane." The Retribution slipped away from Charleston Harbor like a guilty secret, her black sails barely visible against the gray morning sky. As the American coastline faded behind them, Elias stood at the helm, feeling the familiar thrill of open water and freedom. But when he glanced toward the cabin where Isabella Montrose sat under guard, he found himself wondering if he had captured a prisoner, or if she had somehow captured something from him. The die was cast. Admiral Montrose would receive his message within hours and the hunt would begin. But for now, in these precious moments of calm before the storm, Elias allowed himself to savor the taste of revenge, bitter and satisfying as ship's rum. The game had begun. 3 days out from Charleston, the retribution cut through the Atlantic swells like a blade through silk. The autumn winds had been favorable, carrying them southeast toward the treacherous waters between the Carolinas and the Bahamas, territory where British naval patrols were sparse and questions were rarely asked. Elias stood in his cabin, studying the charts spread across his mahogany desk. Red ink marked the patrol routes he'd memorized during his months of exile, while black pins showed safe harbors controlled by men who owed him favors or feared his reputation. Every detail had been planned with the precision of a master strategist, yet he found his attention wandering to the locked door that separated his quarters from the smaller cabin where Isabella Montrose had spent the last 72 hours. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had not even demanded to speak with him. All behaviors he had expected and, in truth, hoped for. Her silence was becoming more unnerving than any tantrum would have been. A knock interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, not looking up from his charts. Torres stepped inside, his usually confident demeanor shadowed by uncertainty. "Captain, we need to discuss the prisoner." "What about her?" "She's unusual, sir." Martinez brought her meals and she thanked him. In Spanish, perfect Spanish with a Castilian accent. Torres paused, clearly troubled. She asked about his family in Seville, new details about the city that only someone who'd lived there would know. Elias finally looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. "Your point?" "My point is that this isn't some sheltered admiral's daughter who faints at the sight of blood. She's educated, observant, and she's studying us. Every man who's had contact with her walks away. Different. Different how?" Torres struggled for words. "Humanized, sir. She makes them remember who they were before they became pirates." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Elias set down his compass with deliberate care, his jaw tightening. He had chosen his crew for their loyalty and their willingness to embrace the darker aspects of their profession. If Isabella Montrose could undo that with mere conversation, she was more dangerous than he had anticipated. "Has she attempted to escape?" "No, sir. That's what's strange. She sits by the porthole, reads the books we gave her, and waits, like she knows something we don't." Elias stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'll speak with her myself." The key turned in the lock with a sound like a musket's hammer falling. Isabella sat in a chair by the small, round window, afternoon sunlight painting gold highlights in her auburn hair. She wore the same blue dress from her capture, though it was now wrinkled and bore the salt stains of sea travel. When she looked up from her book, a volume of poetry he'd provided to keep her occupied, her green eyes held no fear, only a curious intelligence that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. "Captain Crane," she said, rising with practiced grace, "I was wondering when you'd visit. This isn't a social call." He remained by the door, unwilling to venture deeper into the small space that seemed to shrink around her presence. "Of course not. You're here because your men are beginning to see me as a person rather than cargo." She closed the book carefully, her fingers tracing the leather binding. "It must be frustrating when your instruments of revenge develop consciences." The accuracy of her observation was like a knife between his ribs. "You think you're clever. I think I'm observant. Just as I observed the way you hesitated before taking me, the way your hand trembled when you gave the order." She turned to face him fully and he was struck again by her composure. "You're not the monster you pretend to be, Captain. You don't know what I am." The words came out harsher than he intended, roughened by years of violence and betrayal. "I know you were betrayed by men you trusted. I know my father's mercy felt like another humiliation added to your shame. I know you've spent months planning this revenge because the alternative, forgiving and moving forward, seems impossible." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "I also know that keeping me here, watching me day after day, will be harder than you imagine. You're nothing to me but a message to your father. If that were true, you would have sent a finger or a lock of hair. Instead, you took me whole and alive, and you're keeping me comfortable. Why? The question pierced through his carefully constructed walls of hatred. He had told himself it was practical. A living hostage was worth more than a dead one. But standing here in the golden afternoon light, watching her move with unconscious grace despite her circumstances, he wondered if his motivations were as pure as he claimed. Because dead daughters don't suffer, he said finally. Neither do ones who are treated well by their captors. She moved closer, and he caught the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite their harsh surroundings. You're prolonging this because part of you doesn't want it to end. Part of you enjoys having someone to talk to who isn't afraid of you. You should be afraid of me. Why? Because you're a pirate? Because you've killed men? Because you've chosen revenge over redemption? She was close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. I've seen real monsters, Captain. Men who enjoy others' pain, who find pleasure in cruelty. You're not one of them. You're wrong. Prove it. The challenge was quiet, but unmistakable. Show me the monster you claim to be. For a moment they stood in silence. The only sounds the creaking of the ship's timbers and the distant calls of his crew above deck. The afternoon light shifted, casting moving shadows across the small cabin as the Retribution rolled with the swells. Elias realized he was trapped, not by her physical presence, but by the uncomfortable truth of her words. He had brought her aboard as an instrument of revenge, but she was becoming something far more dangerous. A mirror that reflected the man he had been before rage and betrayal had consumed him. Without another word, he turned and left the cabin, locking the door behind him with fingers that shook slightly. As he stood in the corridor, listening to the sounds of his ship around him, Elias Crane began to understand that he might have made a terrible mistake. He had captured Isabella Montrose intending to break her father's heart, but she was systematically dismantling something far more precious: the walls around his own. The storm struck on their 7th day at sea, roaring out of the northeast like the wrath of Neptune himself. What had begun as distant thunder and darkening clouds quickly transformed into a tempest that turned the Retribution into a plaything of wind and wave. Elias stood at the helm, rain lashing his face as he fought to keep the ship steady. Lightning split the black sky, illuminating mountainous waves that threatened to swallow them whole. His crew worked with desperate efficiency, securing lines and adjusting sails as the ship climbed each towering swell, only to plunge into the valley beyond. "Captain!" Torres shouted over the howling wind, struggling to reach him across the rain-slicked deck. The prisoner's cabin. The lock's been damaged by the storm. Elias cursed under his breath. In weather like this, even experienced sailors could be swept overboard in seconds. A terrified captive, unfamiliar with the ship's movement, would be dead within minutes if she tried to flee her cabin. "Take 2 men and secure her," he ordered, then immediately reconsidered. He couldn't spare the hands, and in his heart, he knew he couldn't trust anyone else with her safety. "Belay that. I'll handle it myself." Fighting his way below deck, Elias found the corridor flooded with several inches of seawater that sloshed back and forth with each roll of the ship. The door to Isabella's cabin hung open, its lock indeed broken by the storm's violence. His heart hammered as he rushed inside, expecting to find the cabin empty and his prisoner lost to the sea. Instead, he found Isabella kneeling beside his wounded bosun, pressing a torn piece of her dress against a deep gash on the man's forehead. Old Henrik groaned in pain, his weather-beaten face pale as moonlight. "What happened?" Elias demanded, dropping to his knees beside them. "The ship lurched and he fell against the doorframe," Isabella explained without looking up, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. "He's lost a lot of blood, but the wound isn't as bad as it looks. You could have run." "Where would I go, Captain? We're in the middle of a hurricane." She glanced at him briefly, her green eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Besides, your man needed help." Henrik's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on Isabella's face. "Angel," he whispered in his thick Norwegian accent. "Thought you were an angel." "Just a woman with some knowledge of medicine," she replied gently, continuing to apply pressure to his wound. "My mother insisted I learn. She said a lady should be prepared for anything." Elias watched in fascination as she worked. Her movements were confident and practiced, showing none of the squeamishness he would have expected from a sheltered admiral's daughter. When she needed to clean the wound, she didn't hesitate to use seawater from the floor, and when Henrik cried out in pain, she spoke to him in soothing Norwegian, another language she apparently knew fluently. "We need to get him to a more stable location," she said, looking up at Elias. "Somewhere he can be properly bandaged. The crew's quarters are flooding. My cabin is the only dry space large enough." Without hesitation, she helped Elias lift the injured man. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged Henrik through the lurching corridors to the captain's quarters. Isabella moved with surprising grace despite the ship's violent motion, as if she had spent years at sea rather than days. In his cabin, she immediately took charge of Henrik's care, directing Elias to help position the man on the small settee while she gathered supplies. She worked by lamplight as the storm raged outside, cleaning and bandaging the wound, with an expertise that left Elias speechless. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked as she finished securing the bandage. "Spain," she said simply, washing her hands in the basin. "I spent 2 years in Madrid with my aunt. The convent there taught practical medicine alongside literature and languages. They believed knowledge was a gift to be shared, especially in times of need." "A convent? You're religious?" She considered the question carefully. "I believe in helping others when I can. If that makes me religious, so be it." Henrik had fallen into a peaceful sleep, his breathing steady and strong. The storm still raged outside, but within the cabin, an unexpected calm had settled. Elias found himself studying Isabella in the lamplight, noting the way exhaustion had finally begun to show around her eyes, the way she had unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You saved his life," he said quietly. "He needed help. It was the right thing to do. Even though he's one of your captors?" She turned to face him fully, and in her expression, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not fear or calculation, but a profound sadness that seemed to reach into his very soul. "Captain Crane, I've seen enough of the world to know that good and evil rarely come in pure forms. Your Mr. Henrik has been nothing but kind to me, bringing me meals and ensuring my comfort. Why would I let him suffer when I could help?" She paused, her voice growing softer. "Besides, I think you've suffered enough guilt in your life without adding his death to your conscience." The words hit him like a physical blow. In the space of a week, this woman had gone from captive to healer, from victim to someone who seemed to understand him better than he understood himself. The walls he had built around his heart, reinforced by years of betrayal and violence, felt suddenly as fragile as ship's glass in a storm. "You don't know anything about my conscience. I know you're a good man pretending to be bad because it hurts less than admitting you still care." She moved closer, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I know you've been checking on me every night, standing outside my door to make sure I'm safe. I know you personally selected the books in my cabin, choosing ones that would bring me comfort rather than despair." Elias felt something crack inside his chest like ice breaking under spring sun. "Stop. I know you're terrified that if you let yourself care about me, you'll have to face the fact that revenge has been eating you alive from the inside." She reached out, her fingertips barely brushing his scarred hand. "I know because I can see the man you used to be fighting to surface every time you look at me." The ship lurched violently, throwing them both against the cabin wall. Instinctively, Elias caught her, his arms encircling her as they steadied themselves. For a moment they stood pressed together in the swaying lamplight, her warmth seeping through his shirt, her scent cutting through the salt and storm. "You're wrong about me," he whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "Am I?" She looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Then prove it, Captain. Show me the monster you claim to be." But as the storm raged around them and her compassion washed over him like a tide, Elias Crane realized he could no longer remember how to be the man he had tried so hard to become. The pirate, the killer, the instrument of revenge, all of it seemed to fade in the face of her unwavering grace. Outside, the hurricane screamed its fury at the world. Inside, a different kind of storm was beginning to calm, leaving behind something far more dangerous than rage, the first tentative stirrings of hope. Dawn broke clear and merciless over the Atlantic, revealing the aftermath of the hurricane in brutal detail. The Retribution limped through calm waters, her sails patched and her crew exhausted, but alive. For 3 days since the storm, an uneasy peace had settled over the ship, a peace that Elias knew was about to be shattered. He stood at his cabin window, watching the distant smoke on the horizon that marked the approach of HMS Valiant, Admiral Montrose's flagship. The old man had found them faster than expected, following a trail of rumors and port gossip that led inexorably to this moment. In less than 2 hours, the reckoning would begin. Behind him, Isabella sat at his desk, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the approaching danger. Since the storm, the pretense of her imprisonment had gradually dissolved. She moved freely about the ship now, tending to the wounded and earning the fierce loyalty of men who had spent years hardening their hearts against such gentleness. "You could have signaled them last night," Elias said without turning around, when their lanterns were visible on the horizon. A piece of cloth, a reflection from the window. "Your father would have seen it." "I could have," she agreed quietly. "Just as you could have changed course and avoided this confrontation entirely." He turned to face her, noting how the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. 10 days aboard his ship had changed her. The pristine lady who had stepped from her carriage in Charleston was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. "Why didn't you signal them?" Isabella considered the question carefully, as she did everything. "Because I wanted to see what choice you would make when the moment came, whether you would choose revenge or redemption. And what if I choose revenge? Then you'll discover that some victories cost more than defeats." She stood gracefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, the same blue gown she had worn since her capture, now bearing the honest stains of shipboard life. "But I don't think you will." A knock at the door interrupted them. Torres entered, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of approaching battle. "Captain, the Valiant will be in cannon range within the hour. She's running with a full spread of sail. Montrose means business." Elias nodded, his mind already calculating angles of escape and strategies for survival. The retribution was fast, but she was damaged from the storm and outnumbered. If it came to a fight, they would be lucky to last 10 minutes against the British ship of the line. "What are your orders, sir?" Torres asked, though his eyes kept drifting to Isabella with something approaching reverence. "Prepare for battle," Elias said automatically, then paused. The words felt hollow, meaningless. He looked at Isabella, seeing no fear in her green eyes, only a sad certainty that made his chest ache. "No. Belay that order." Torres blinked in confusion. "Sir? Signal our surrender. Full white flag. No deception." "Captain, you heard me." Elias's voice carried the authority of command, but underneath lay something Torres had never heard before. Peace. Signal surrender and prepare to receive Admiral Montrose aboard. As Torres hurried away to carry out the unprecedented order, Isabella stepped closer to Elias. That was the right choice. Was it? "My crew will hang for piracy. I'll hang for kidnapping an admiral's daughter. Your father's justice isn't known for its mercy." "No," she said softly, "but his daughter's is." The next hour passed with dreamlike slowness. The retribution struck her colors and came about, presenting her stern to the approaching British warship in the traditional gesture of submission. Through his spyglass, Elias could see the activity on the Valiant's deck as Marines prepared for boarding, and cannons were run out in case of treachery. When the ships lay alongside each other, connected by grappling hooks and boarding planks, Admiral Sir Charles Montrose himself led the boarding party. He was a man in his 50s, silver-haired and bearing the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of command. His blue eyes, so like his daughter's, swept the deck of the pirate vessel with cold assessment before settling on Elias. "Captain Crane," he said, his voice carrying the crisp accent of British nobility. "I must admit, I expected more of a fight from the legendary pirate who once terrorized these waters." "Times change, Admiral." Elias stepped forward, making no move toward his weapons. Around them, British Marines had formed a protective circle, their muskets trained on the pirate crew. "Indeed they do." Montrose's gaze shifted to Isabella, who stood calmly beside the mainmast. Relief flickered across his features, followed quickly by rage. "I trust my daughter has been treated with appropriate respect?" "She has been treated," Elias said carefully, "as she deserved to be treated." Isabella moved forward before her father could respond, her steps measured and deliberate. "Father, I must speak with you privately before you pass judgment on these men." "Isabella, you've been through an ordeal. You need medical attention, rest. I need you to listen to me." There was steel in her voice, an authority that matched his own. "Captain Crane saved my life during the storm. His crew treated me with kindness and respect. And I have learned things about honor and redemption that I could never have discovered in Charleston drawing rooms." Admiral Montrose studied his daughter's face, noting the changes that 10 days at sea had wrought. "What are you saying, child?" "I'm saying that Captain Crane is not the monster you believe him to be. Yes, he took me for revenge, but he has protected me, cared for me, and ultimately chose surrender over a battle that would have cost innocent lives. She paused, looking back at Elias with an expression that made his heart race. I'm saying that hanging him would be the greatest injustice of your career. The Admiral's face darkened. Isabella, you cannot possibly understand. I understand that you spared his life once before and he used that mercy to become a better man, not a worse one. Her voice carried across the silent deck, reaching every man present. I understand that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose compassion over vengeance. Elias felt the world shift around him, as if the very deck of his ship had become unsteady. She was defending him, risking her father's anger and her own reputation to protect the man who had kidnapped her. The magnitude of her grace left him speechless. And what would you have me do? Admiral Montrose asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Ignore his crimes? Pretend that piracy and kidnapping can be forgiven with pretty words? Isabella looked directly at Elias, her green eyes holding his with unwavering intensity. I would have you give him the same choice you gave him before, exile or death. But this time, I believe he will choose differently. The silence stretched between the ships, broken only by the creaking of rigging and the lap of waves against the hulls. Every man present seemed to hold his breath, waiting for the Admiral's decision. Finally, Montrose spoke. Captain Crane, my daughter seems to believe you capable of redemption. Against my better judgment, I am inclined to trust her assessment. He paused, his voice hardening. You will surrender your ship and crew to my custody. Your men will face trial for piracy, though I will recommend transportation rather than hanging for those who cooperate. As for you, Elias straightened, prepared to accept whatever judgment came. You will accompany me to London where you will face the Admiralty Court. Your fate will be decided by men wiser than myself. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. But I warn you, if you have harmed my daughter in any way, if this apparent transformation proves false, I will personally ensure your death is neither quick nor merciful. I understand, Admiral. Isabella stepped forward again, her hand briefly touching Elias's arm. There's something else, Father. Captain Crane's crew, they're not common pirates. Many are deserters from various navies, men driven to desperation by circumstances beyond their control. They deserve a chance at redemption as well. As the formal surrender proceeded, with Elias's crew being transferred to the Valiant Underguard, Isabella found herself standing beside him at the rail of his former ship. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the calm waters. Why? He asked quietly. Why risk everything to defend me? She was silent for a long moment, watching the play of light on the waves. Because in 10 days, you showed me more genuine humanity than I've seen in 20 years of London society. Because you could have used me cruelly and chose kindness instead. Because you taught me that people can change, that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. And if I hang in London, then you'll hang as a man who chose honor over revenge in the end. That's more than most people achieve in a lifetime. She turned to face him and he was startled to see tears in her eyes. But I don't think you'll hang, Elias. I think you're going to live, and I think you're going to spend the rest of your life proving that my faith in you was justified. As they were separated, she to comfortable quarters aboard her father's ship, he to the brig as a prisoner of the crown, Elias carried with him the memory of her words and the warmth of her touch. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking not of the past and its failures, but of the future and its possibilities. The game that had begun with kidnapping and revenge had ended with something neither player had expected. The discovery that love could grow even in the darkest soil, and that redemption was always possible for those willing to reach for it. As the two ships sailed toward their separate destinies, both captive and captor had been transformed by the realization that the strongest chains were not made of iron, but of the compassion that bound human hearts together across any divide. The pirate who had sought to destroy an admiral's daughter had instead found himself redeemed by her grace, while the lady who had been taken as revenge had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. In the end, both had become prisoners of something far more powerful than any ship or cell, the love that had grown between them like hope rising from the ashes of despair.